Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 337. Let's end Good Jew, Bad Jew. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and I'm not Dan Levinson. So if you're listening and you're thinking, wait a second, what's the deal? Dan is always the one who does the intros. Why is Lex talking? That is an accurate thought. And a little context, Dan unfortunately has COVID right now. Between when we recorded the body of this episode, the main conversation, and when we're releasing it, Dan got COVID. He is feeling okay, not great, but he is feeling okay. His voice is definitely out of sorts though, so I am pinch hitting to record this intro that usually he does. This is a good moment to note that the show always must go on at Judaism Unbound. We've had many obstacles that have attempted at various stages to stand in the way of an episode coming out of Judaism Unbound. But one of our proudest achievements over the years is that we have never missed 1 week. Ever since we started in March of 2016, we have released a new episode every Friday morning, and we intend to keep it that way. So send your love to Dan. You can send literal emails to him, or you can just, think of him and send him the best for a rapid healing. So, we do have a really fantastic conversation on the horn today, and to give a little bit of context, there's a lot of Jewish communal studies. If you're a frequent listener of this podcast, or even just an every once in a while listener, you have probably heard Dan and I critique some of these Jewish communal studies, and the questions they ask, the questions they don't ask, and how they're structured and sort of what they're used to do. So, when a recent Jewish communal study of Los Angeles was released, both Dan and I got very energized, and we weren't expecting that. This was a study that aligned very much with the kinds of questions we think are important to be asking. And so in our conversation today with Janet Krasner Aronson, we're going to dive into the study. We're going to look at some of the key ways in which it differs from other Jewish communal studies and why studies like this are important in the first place. So the 2021 study of Jewish LA paints a portrait of Greater Los Angeles' Jewish community, the second largest Jewish community in the United States. The study was conducted by a team of researchers at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University and NORC at the University of Chicago, an independent, nonpartisan research institute. The study employed innovative, state-of-the-art methods to create a comprehensive description of the characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors of members of the Jewish community in Greater Los Angeles. Janet Krasner Aronson, our guest today, was the director of this study, and she is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She has directed studies in Boston, Washington, D.C., Palm Beach County, Florida, and Cincinnati. She also teaches in the Hornstein Program for Jewish Professional Leadership at Brandeis University. Prior to joining the Cohen Center, she worked as a computer programmer, a graphic designer, and a religious school teacher. We've talked on the show about how important it is to have people working in Jewish life or studying Jews who have many other experiences, and Janet Krasner Aronson is a perfect example of that. She was a member of the first cohort of the Barnard College Jewish Theological Seminary double degree program, in which she earned bachelor's degrees in computer science and Bible. She has a master's degree in applied sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and she earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis University. Janet Krasner Aronson, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on the show.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, a lot of people were happy with your study that came out. Actually, I don't know how many people were happy, but it was the first Jewish study that I found out about that had like a positive news headline attached to it, which was that more young people than older people were connected to Judaism in the way that you were describing what that connection looks like. And that was something that is like the opposite of what everybody thinks is happening. And it's not that your study, shows something that the other studies don't show. I wanted you to actually talk a little bit about that. Like, why is it that the methodology of your study actually was able to paint a different picture of Jewish life in Los Angeles than a lot of the other studies do? And could you talk a little bit about what you did find before you tell us why it came out that way?
Sure. This is definitely not the first study that showed this. The first major study that I worked on was the study of Boston in 2015. Pretty much showed the same thing, that when we look at all kinds of Jewish engagement, not just, looking at one measure like synagogue membership, which I'm sure we'll talk about, there are actually very few differences by age. And we found that in Boston, in Washington, in Chicago, and LA is just one of the most recent things. And it certainly runs counter to the narrative out there about this decline, that younger people are less engaged in Jewish life. I think that the main headline is they're engaged differently. What is different in LA is that engagement among older people is low relative to the whole population. Usually they're kind of more similar to one another, and it's just, different ways of engaging. We find older people are more involved in like sort of the traditional ways of engaging, belonging to synagogues, belonging to organizations, donating to federation. Those are probably the three big ones. And younger people are doing more alternative ways. And in LA, the rates among older people to do those things were not as high as we've seen in some other communities.
It's like I always imagine them doing a study, in the late Second Temple period to see like how many people are bringing sacrifices, and those numbers come out low, but it turns out that there are all these other newfangled things like synagogues that are on the up and up, right? And they're
I love
coming up.
that. I love that. And I think like that goes to a really good point. It's like, there's nothing new under the sun. And a lot of the patterns that we see, I think, in the contemporary Jewish life have been going on forever, including older people worrying about the younger generation, lamenting the loss of Jewish life, when in fact, it just looks really different than the Jewish life that they're used to.
That should be one of the questions on the survey. How much time do you spend lamenting the decline of Jewish life? And,
right.
I'd be happy to join your team to come up with the questions for the next survey.
That's a fun part.
Well, actually, let's talk about the questions a little bit, just because I think it's really something that people don't think about that much in terms of how these kinds of studies are done. But it kind of shows what you think Judaism is, in a way, the way those questions are asked. I mean, I was making a joke, but really people back in the Second Temple period thought that Judaism was defined by making sacrifices, and how pure were you when you made the sacrifices, and how unblemished or blemished were the animals, and all those would be the questions that would be on the survey.
Right.
And if you were to give that survey to a certain population that either because of necessity, because the temple had been destroyed, or just because of lack of interest, they wouldn't have come out so well in that survey. And yet we know that there was a Judaism being born at that time that is the Judaism that we all know. And so we can assume, or we can imagine, that it's possible that something like that is happening now. How do you think about that and discovering that in terms of the questions that are asked on a survey like this?
That is such an important question, and such a really interesting and challenging part of this work. I think it's probably my favorite part of this work, designing the survey instruments. So there are an awful lot of things you have to ask on the survey just to be able to figure out how many Jewish people live in the community, what are their ages, what is their race, how many children, and who in the household is Jewish and who isn't, and all the different ways of being Jewish. And you kind of need all that. That's a big chunk of the survey. And so then that leaves you the rest of the survey. And our surveys tend to be long. They're usually about a half hour to take online. But then we have to talk about what does the community most want to know? And it's kind of a moving target. So each community is a little bit different. The questions change over time. So questions about gender, how you ask gender, have been shifting as we try to come up with the most appropriate and economical way to ask the kinds of questions that we, to get the information we need. Questions about race. But then there are topics that are specific to each community. And in every community, we work to develop new questions. And some of them are really specific to, let's say, the geography or the institutions, or in LA, the ethnic diversity. I mean, it's the first community that we've studied that has a significant Persian Jewish population. So we had to add questions to make sure, and we were identifying people in that population appropriately. And that was the subject of a lot of discussion. Then there are a lot of questions about attitudes about contemporary topics, attitudes about Israel. What does it mean to be Jewish? What's important about being Jewish? And then there's a whole other area, which is a lot of communities are interested in, what about people's non-Jewish lives? Judaism doesn't exist in a vacuum. So they want to know, let's say you're really interested in cultural programs. You might want to know, I mean, people aren't just doing their Judaism, their cultural programs with Jewish institutions. Maybe they're doing them with non-Jewish, or they're doing both, and kind of how those fit together.
I am really energized talking to you because A, I'm just such a numbers obsessed person, as our listeners know, but B, I read the findings of this study and I looked far too much than a healthy person might into the structure and study design. And I really got energized because I felt not about the specific numbers, actually, not about like, oh, this finding is really interesting. I mean, I agree that what Dan identified in terms of younger Jews being very engaged in a way that contradicts some of the narratives is exciting. But for me, it was more about the kinds of questions you asked and in certain ways didn't ask. And what I mean by that is, first off, what you just said about how people aren't just their Judaism, right? Like you asked questions about people's financial well-being, about their psychological well-being. And I don't know that you're the first one ever to do that either. There certainly on the financial well-being, I've read studies for a long, long time that explore that. Mm-hmm. I do think that some of the ways you ask questions about mental health, psychological health struck me maybe not as entirely new, but as rare or like new-ish. And I was really excited to have a study that looked not just at what I would call like communal health, like are the institutions doing well, are people supporting them, but actually also at people's psychological well-being and physical well-being, like their physical health. Right. So that was one piece I wanted to hear from you about, is the psychological well-being, how that played into the decision-making you made around this study. But really, I'm just generally interested in the ways in which this study, to some extent, might have been, I don't want to say straying from or like totally bucking the norms of other studies, but ways in which it's a little different, ways in which its setup is not so much about like, is the Jewish community shrinking? Is it growing? These headline grabbers. Are there more intermarried Jews now than there were a little while? Like, you looked at those questions. You asked about intermarriage. You asked about, like, those weren't the top of the page. They were, and for me as a person in an interfaith relationship myself, the fact that the conversation didn't end there, it wasn't just, are you intermarried? Sort of check, move on, good, bad. If you're not intermarried. It was, how many non-Jews are there that are part of these households? What do those households look like? What are the trends? Like, the people who aren't Jews are part of this. They're part of the Jewish community or the Jewish population, not as Jews, but they're in the conversation, and you identified that. So I'm throwing a lot at you, but basically to distill on the psychological well-being front and on the front of sort of ways in which this is different from other studies, what would you bring to us?
I'll start with the psychological well-being, the mental health. So these questions really came out as a result of COVID. During the beginning of COVID, we were actually about to launch 2 different studies, and we put them on hold to figure out what to do. We eventually did launch them, and they were during COVID, but we had to regroup and change some of the questions. But in between, the Cohen Center decided to, what are we going to do? What's our role in this crisis that's going on in the world? And we decided to do a study of what wound up being 10 different Jewish communities during COVID. What was the impact of COVID on Jewish life? Primarily looked at finances, health, including mental health, and participation in Jewish life. Very interesting findings. But one of the first ones that jumped out was this issue of mental health for young adults. When we went into that study, what everybody was worried about was isolated seniors. How are isolated seniors going to cope with being in quarantine, knowing they didn't have the access to Zoom and all of the technology that was going to keep them connected? So that was the big worry. And I remember when we first got the results of the first study we ran, and we said, this is kind of bizarre. The people who are reporting all of these mental health issues, struggling, having trouble coping, were the young adults. And everybody thought they'd be fine because they were all on their phones anyway. What difference did it make? Turns out they were not fine. And then shortly after that, we started seeing the same findings put out by the CDC, by all kinds of, non-Jewish surveys. And so that's been very well documented. So after we found that, we started introducing those similar questions to all of the community studies, and it's been a consistent finding. Now, this is a great example of, we don't know what would have happened if we asked that question in 2019. Maybe this was always a pattern. Young adults, younger people think really differently about what it means to have trouble coping, what it means to need mental health services. And it may be that it's not that they are having more difficulties, but it's just how they describe it and think about it and report it is different. But consistently, this is a national pattern, and it's a very, very important finding. So it's a great example of what is the Jewish community supposed to do? We have this finding. It's consistent. We see it from city to city. We see it in the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community. What's the Jewish community's role? And I see kind of a couple of possibilities. One is the Jewish community provides mental health services. Depending upon the community, that might not be the best strategy, because maybe they're not in the position to provide the services, but what they should be doing is connecting people to services, or helping people afford services if they can't. But the other question is, what is the unique role in the Jewish community in addressing a problem like that? If we know that one of the reasons for psychological difficulty is isolation, not feeling a sense of community and connection, well, maybe that's something that the Jewish community might consider doing something about.
Yeah, I'm glad you took it there. What was going on in my mind was a third possibility, or a third question, which is is Judaism actually helpful for mental health? Right, no, is there, I mean, I'm not saying that it's hurtful, although it might be. People think about Judaism as something for spirituality or intellectual. Look, if it's just a challenge of a few years because of COVID, that's one thing. But people are talking about much larger mental health crises and crises of loneliness and things of that nature. And it really raises the question for me, again, when we go back to that example of, will Judaism change from being about the sacrifices to being about prayers in synagogues? Maybe we're in a time where we need Judaism to change again from being about prayers in synagogues to being about helping people with living in the world in difficult times, right?
Yeah, that's it. So I'm trying to find the numbers, because these were not released in LA, but we've asked them in other communities. We ask questions like, does Judaism help you celebrate at times of joy? And does Judaism help you cope in times of crisis? So not surprisingly, the more Jewishly engaged you are, the more you will say yes to both. And I'm going to try to pull up the number while we're talking. But in general, I think that people say Judaism helps at times of joy more than it helps at times of crisis. When you have a baby and there's a baby naming and a wedding and a bar mitzvah, those are all times of celebration that are done in Jewish context. Great example of a Shiva, which I think many people consider one of the most powerful Jewish practices, that is kind of unique to Judaism, that the way Judaism, supports people at the time of loss is really unique and beautiful and powerful. But I think that you're sort of hitting the heart of the question to me. And it's what is Judaism about in 2022? And how do people think it informs their lives? Most people are not living their lives where every single decision and aspect of their life is living in a Jewish context. Most people, their life is integrated into the non-Jewish world to some extent. And whether Judaism provides some, whatever it is, connections, sense of community, sense of values, sense of meaning. And it's not going to be the same answer for everybody, but I think that that's something that is missing from the whole conversation. And a lot of people, I think, don't know what Judaism has to offer. The problem is that for many people, Judaism is, I have a Seder, it's wonderful, it's meaningful or not, it's wonderful. It might be about family, it might be about history, it might be about tradition, it might be about the deeper meanings of Passover. But I think when it comes to their day-to-day lives, I don't know how much people take those lessons of the Seder and say, oh, this informs the choices that I'm making today in my non-Jewish life.
Yeah. So I'm continuing to be a nerd and loving your study. And I have a question about a nerdy term that I'm going to say here, just so people can Google it and learn, but also so you can define it a little bit. Latent class analysis. I promise everyone, this is super exciting. It's really interesting. This is not your boring textbook word that you're going to glaze your eyes over at. This is really interesting to people who are listeners of our show and interested in how Jewish communal studies are done and how Judaism, structures itself institutionally and otherwise. So I'll give a little taste of my sense, and then you'll tell me where I got everything wrong. My sense of latent class analysis is that this is a way statistically that you can, instead of sorting everybody into sort of a binary, this kind of Jew or you're that kind of Jew, you can instead create groupings. In your case, 5 groupings, but it's a process where you take a broad sample and you sort people by different groupings of practices, and you can find really interesting things. And then it allows you to say, there might not be one solution, one thing that's going to serve all Jews. It might be that this grouping of Jews, this class of Jews, class not in the economic sense, but this class of Jews, they might be interested specifically in, communal, social, affiliational, those interactions with other Jews, but maybe they're not going to services. And then this other group of Jews might actually regularly go to services, but they're actually not so interested in organizational affiliation with JCCs or some of the more focused on social or cultural thing. It's a really helpful tool to be able to say what kind of Jewish people are doing, as opposed to what I think a lot of studies have overly focused on, which is the question of are they doing Jewish or not? How much are they doing enough that the Jewish community will continue to sustain itself, or are we going to all perish, and not literally, but go away?
Right.
You are not asking that question. And so I'd love to hear more about those 5 groupings, but also about the broader process of saying, you know what? We're not just going to say everybody's either a Jew of no religion or a Jew of religion. We're not going to say everybody's either unaffiliated with a synagogue or affiliated. We're actually going to say it's more complicated than that.
So that's exactly right. And when I explain it, that's usually where I start. That often when people think about the Jewish community, that's the word, affiliated or unaffiliated. It's a binary, and affiliated usually means a synagogue member or donor to federation. Maybe there's some other things, but that's primary. And people never say that, but that's actually what they're usually thinking about. And I think what comes with that is, unfortunately, good Jew, bad Jew. There's definitely a judgment in there, but our goal is not really to answer that question of how do we make sure that existing institutions continue to exist. Our goal is to be more descriptive. And I think this is a theme of the whole study. It's a goal. This is what the community looks like. It's a snapshot. It's a portrait in this year, this point in time. What are all of the dimensions of Jewish life, including the demographic, the financial, the health, and the ways people engage in Jewish life, that practices that they do or don't do, and the way they think about their Jewish lives. I'll just say, go back to something you raised before, one reason why in this study there isn't a lot of comparative, like looking at trends and saying, oh, intermarriage is down or up and synagogue membership is down, right? It's because the last study that LA did was in 1997. It was a very different method. And so we made the decision that other than looking at overall population, we're not going to do any comparisons. We only compare to national numbers from the Pew study.
I think that's really important. And I think it points to something that I said briefly before about like not being sort of headline grabby.
Right.
In addition to practically like 1997 is a while ago and you don't want to be sloppy about saying all the methodology was the same. Like, in addition to that, by not comparing, you're not playing the game that I think a lot of people want to play with these studies. I think a lot of people, these studies are a chance. And by the way, I'd include us in this sometimes. Like, you read the study and you're trying to find the data points that your organization is going to throw out there about what has changed in the last 10 years or whatever. And like some scary trend that your organization is the answer for. Like, oh, people think a different way about Israel. And if you support our organization, they'll think more the way you want them to. Or people are intermarrying, or people are doing lots of digital stuff. And so that means support Judaism Unbound. Like, I want to say us too, because I don't want it to sound just like I'm talking about others. Like, that's what people are really like rubbing their hands and ready to do with these studies. And you're saying, you know what, like, let's get a snapshot.
Right.
Let's look at 2022, or I guess 2021 was when it started. Like, you can actually learn a lot in a snapshot. People say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? It's not only videos that have time durations that can capture something. We try to make the videos. We try to like take a snapshot and presume it's like if you went to an art museum and you were asking like where the people in the photo are walking to, or where they're walking from. Like, that's fun. And it's like a worthy exercise, but the snapshot has plenty there. So maybe I'm curious a little more to hear, why aren't you talking so much about like, there's more intermarried Jews than there once were. There's more younger Jews involved than there once was. Why is that?
Well, I think one of the things is people like stories. People like comparison points. Like I can tell you that X% of households in LA belong to a synagogue, or X% intermarried. And people want to know, like, is this good or bad? Should I be worried about it? Is this a problem? And so I think without some comparison point, it's really hard for people to look at a number and say, what am I supposed to think about this number? And a lot of times, communities will they'll ask for comparisons to the previous study or to Pew or to other communities. And one thing that we do not ever do, is put comparisons across communities in a report. All the reports are on our website. People are welcome to look, but we don't see any value. And we don't see it because the reasons that community A and community B may be different on any of these measures are vast. It's not necessarily because of something that an organization did or didn't do. It might be because of the general economy or the general political scene. So I think that people sort of then they look at the trends and they attribute a cause and effect, which is just not there. That's why we stay away from that. But at the same time, I really understand this difficulty in like knowing how to respond to a number on a page. But what are we even supposed to think about that? So I do want to talk, though, about this latent class analysis, because it is really important. And so that helped frame our goal to create this portrait. What does Jewish life look like in this community at this time? In addition to not just basing this analysis on some of those standard measures like synagogue membership, donation to Federation, lighting Shabbat candles, we've developed a list of about 20 behaviors. And we say some of these behaviors, somebody might consider this is essential to Jewish life. And some behaviors, somebody might say like, oh, that doesn't mean that much, because it ranges from everything like eating traditional Jewish foods, to following news about Israel, to talking to your friends about Jewish topics, to engaging in Jewish culture, watching, reading books, watching films. And then the traditional things, donating to organizations, belonging to organizations. And then it's some ritual behaviors, lighting Shabbat candles or marking Shabbat in some way, fasting on Yom Kippur, which is an interesting one. And so then we put this all right. And as you said, it goes into a statistical model. So instead, this is latent class analysis. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to give what many analyses like this would do is we're going to give each behavior some points. Maybe the really important ones, we'll give them each 5 points. And then the ones, not so important, we'll give you 1 point. And then we give everybody a score for how many of these things you do. And we could make some of them count for more than others. And then everybody gets a score. And then you wind up, it might not be a binary, but it's a good to bad. It's a ladder. And it sort of implies the more you do, the better Jew, the less you do, not as good a Jew, and 80 to 100 is an A, and so forth. We don't do it that way. So what we're actually looking for is the patterns. There are people who, of those 20 things, they do 19 out of 20. Like they just do all of them. And that's what we call the immersed group. Then there's a group that does a very little. The interesting thing are the groups in the middle, because some people might come in with the assumption that kind of the more you do, the more you do. And that's actually not true. And we find that different kinds of behaviors cluster together. And that's what this latent class analysis is designed to capture, is that there are a group of people who do these kinds of things and they don't do those kinds of things. So in Los Angeles, the interesting groups were the communal and the ritual groups.
Just to clarify, those are the names of the two groups in your analysis.
Right.
Yeah.
We develop these 5 groups and then we look at them. We look at what they do and we give them names. So in Los Angeles, we have 2 groups that we call the ritual group and one we call the communal group. The ritual group, most of their Jewish activities are ritual related. So they're more likely to mark Shabbat in some way, to go to services, go to high holiday services, have Passover, have Hanukkah. Those are their big things. The communal group doesn't do as much of those things, but they're more likely to belong to an organization, donate, volunteer, and do the support of institutions. You can't say that one of these groups is more Jewishly engaged or less Jewishly engaged than the other. You can only understand that these are differently engaged, and regardless of the way of they engage in Jewish life, they are equally likely to say Judaism is part of my daily life, to say what are the things that are important to me about Jewish life. Some of those questions about, does Judah, that I mentioned before, Judaism helps me cope in times of crisis. So they're very similar in terms of how important Judaism is, but they just express it in different ways. The message there is there are many ways to engage in Jewish life, and they're not better or worse. They're just different.
We've had this conversation in particular with folks from the Hartman Institute about the idea of Genesis Jews, who are the people who really think of Judaism as a family, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were a family, and that's why people are Jewish, and Exodus Jews, which are the people who believe that Judaism was a set of ideas that we in some way received, maybe from God, maybe on a mountain, maybe not, but that Judaism is about the kind of ideas content of Judaism, right? And this kind of tracks with that, in that those are 2 different kinds of ways of being Jewish. And very few people say, oh, you believe Judaism is family, that's wrong. And very few people say, oh, you believe Judaism's about the Torah, that's wrong. People are some people will say, oh, well, it's really about both, and you really should, take an interest in the other one. But There is some understanding that there are alternative legitimate ways to be Jewish. I mean, look, a lot of people say, oh, if you're a big Zionist, if you support Israel, like that's okay. That you don't have to do anything else. That's a great way to be Jewish. Okay, fine. But like there are all kinds of other ways to be Jewish as well, which don't sort of get that street cred. So it's interesting to be introducing new categories.
But I think that what you're raising is really important, and it's an essential challenge. It is maybe the essential challenge for the Jewish community is, there was a time, I think, that the Jewish community could unify around certain ideas and say, like, it doesn't matter if you do this or this or this, 60s, 70s, as long as you supported Israel, it doesn't matter what else you do. And even then, there were people who didn't support Israel who were definitely Jewish. So we sometimes forget that, but that was certainly true. But there was a perception that there was some unity, something that binds us together. And I think that that's a challenge for the Jewish community right now, because that's what seems to be kind of, I don't want to say disintegrating, that sounds too negative, but like we're not finding it. And we're seeing just as we see polarization in American life, we see polarization in the Jewish world, not of the majority. I mean, polarization, I guess, by definition, is like the people at the ends are really having trouble saying, I can accept you as Jewish, even though you practice it in a very different way than I do. Perhaps the conversation is shifting enough about intermarriage now. For a long time, that was the line, we don't care what you do, as long as you marry someone Jewish and raise your children Jewish, you're not breaking the chain. There has been enough evidence that intermarried families are, if they choose to be, and if they feel welcome, highly connected in Jewish life and having Jewish homes. The conversation has changed. And I think that that's why it's not a big theme in the Los Angeles report, because I think it's kind of like we're past it. This is the Jewish community. We know a lot of people are intermarried, but I think that there's a lot of fear. And this is something that is really concerning to me, is what binds us together. One of the few things that's left is concern about anti-Semitism. And yes, I mean, if you look at the percentage of people who are very worried about anti-Semitism, doesn't matter what your Jewish engagement looks like, everybody's worried. But when I think about things that I want to, use to bind the community together, that one is not appealing. I'd rather go with something that's more positive.
Yeah. I'm actually thinking back to when we were talking about psychological well-being and the ways in which younger people are describing a lot of mental health challenges. I wanted to slip in my own take on some of that, which is that I think sometimes there's really a disconnect between older and younger generations around just how much despair people feel about climate change, for one, and the state of our country for another. So like
yes.
Global and national. I think I'm not here to say that anybody's unaware that that's the case, but when you're at a certain stage of life, and I'm not saying that people don't care about other, but if you're older and you're looking at, the next decade or two that you're going to be around versus when you're 20 or 25 and, God willing, you're thinking about the next 50, 60, 70 years of your life, the fact that you're not sure whether the world will exist or be inhabitable in the same way, the fact that our country is dissolving in certain senses, like that plays a real psychological role in people's day-to-day lives. And I think it's important for me as a young-ish person. I look at the numbers. I'm nearing the average age of the United States. I think most people think it's much higher than it actually is. The average age, the mean age is 38 in the United States. Uh-huh. And that usually surprises people when I say that. So I don't get to say I'm a young person for much longer. So I'm taking my stab at that. But I actually have an inverse piece of this too, which is, I don't want to say a call out, but like, I want to talk to my fellow young-ish people about how I hope we don't take that headline grabbing study from the beginning. I don't want us to be saying, like, celebrating, oh yes, it's so wonderful. Young people are more engaged by certain measures. A higher proportion of them are in that immersed category. A lower percentage of them are in the minimally involved category than, people 75 and up. We could easily celebrate that. But I don't want to do that so much. Because that points to the trend line thing. That points to this, constantly thinking about the future and not just the snapshot.
Right.
If we think about the snapshot, maybe we're not where we need to be in terms of engaging Jews 75 and up. Maybe we have assumed for a long time that those people just sort of show up. They're the standard bearers, and we have to work really hard to get other people. And so, credit to Jewish institutions, credit to all sorts of things. And like you said, credit maybe to broader societal trends. I think spirituality is cool in a way for younger people that it hasn't always been. But I kind of want to ask, I know you're not the policy prescriber. You're not the person to say, we should make these 4 things to make our Jewish communities better. But how might we think about the younger, older axis here? Because I see it on both fronts. I see it on the psychological front, and I also see it on the Jewish engagement front. And I want to caution us against seeing it too starkly as, psychologically, young people are distraught and old people are great. And, Jewish engagement wise, the old people, they're not involved, but it's fine because we're doing better moving forward.
If an organization, if the Jewish community or individual organization or collective say, like, we want to meet the needs of a group, they got to sort of choose, where are we going to direct our resources? Because of the concern about Jewish continuity, there has been so much emphasis on younger people. And I think it is because they're still of the age that they're going to maybe they already have children, or they're going to have children. And it all comes down to the Jewish continuity, hoping that then they will raise their children Jewish. For older people, there is a sense of, it doesn't matter. They've made their choices. What's done is done. There is an organization I've started to get involved with called Active Aging. And they're really looking about Jewish engagement among older people. They're like really starting to explore this. In their study that we did in Chicago, the group that was least engaged was single people who were like in their 40s and 50s. Nobody looks at that. And not surprising, who's doing anything for them. But I'm going to say something else. To some extent, you need programs that are geared towards specific demographics. But I think that we could think more creatively about that, because I think if we had wonderful, enriching programs about culture, about spirituality, about how to find meaning in your life, and they were great, I think that they would appeal very broadly. In the most thriving synagogues, you see multiple generations sitting together and doing the same thing, even if the children are in their own service. By focusing on certain demographics, we kind of further divide the community. And I'll just say that a lot of times when on the surveys, we'll get the people in the community, the people, the professionals, the planners will say, ask people a question, what do you want? And in various forms, tell us what you want and we'll do that. And then you'll be more Jewishly engaged. And what I have to say is people don't know what they want. People might know what they don't want. People can talk about what they're already doing. But it takes a lot of work to say, hey, what would be great to bring this community together is we're going to do a citywide Jewish film festival. And that's really hard. That takes a lot of thinking. But people might hear it and say, hey, that sounds interesting. That sounds fun. So you can't put it on the members of the community to say, you come up with it. Many of them are much more concerned about the non-Jewish issues in the world. And there's not, yes, young adults, but everybody much more concerned about not only the non-Jewish crises in the world, but raising their kids and their job and all of their, cares of life. And they're not sitting there thinking, what should the Jewish community do for me that will make me more engaged? They'll just know,
Yep.
here are the menu of options that I'm aware of. I'll do them or not do them.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I want to reframe those things that you just mentioned as Jewish issues or as Jewish acts, right? I mean, I've talked about wanting to feel that when I recycle things, I'm actually engaging in a Jewish behavior that just has not yet been given the stamp of Jewish approval by putting it in the Shulchan Aruch or wherever.
That's right. Or a bracha. Like, imagine if there was a bracha every time you put something in the recycling bin.
And Dan, it's like the example we've given about how if we thought of climate change as anti-Semitism, like the thing that's threatening the most Jews is climate change.
Like if there were studies out there and they were, coming out and being published in E-Jewish Philanthropy or The Forward or whatever, and it'd be saying like, wow, 82% of Jews are recycling. They're engaging in so much Jewish activity.
Yes.
It's amazing. So let me ask you about a sort of a big picture question about sort of how these studies are funded and how they relate to academia. I was actually thinking along the lines of this when I noticed one of the questions or one of the answers, I don't remember, in the study was basically putting consuming Jewish media as an act of, like lighting Shabbat candles, all these other things. So now consuming Jewish media, I was very excited about that. I was wondering how many of those people that answered positively, listen to Judaism Unbound. But I was thinking about who funds these studies, because I think that I read that a study like this cost something like $2 million. And honestly, $2 million would probably run Judaism Unbound for pretty much a decade. And so it's not so the question is, who's funding these studies, which are, I guess, usually federations, and that's totally fine. I think that their role is to allocate funds. And so you tell me, I would imagine they're trying to understand the needs in the community so that they can decide how to allocate the funds. However, in my experience, they don't actually tend to make huge changes in the allocations of the funds. They make relatively small changes in the allocations of the funds based on these studies. And there's a whole nother world of Jewish actors out there who could never afford to put a study like this. I'm also thinking about small communities that don't have a federation large enough to study them. And then you're saying, rightly so on the science, that we can't compare LA to another place. But how do those communities sort of know what to do? And that's where I'm sort of wondering about the role of academia and potentially saying, well, we do have now quite a few of these local studies. So is there somebody out there who's saying, yeah, we can actually make certain comparisons, and there are certain, top line things that we can be saying, or that maybe somebody out there should be saying, so that we can really understand what might be the future for Judaism on a larger scale?
Right. So generally it's federations in, conjunction with local, community foundations or other funders. The LA study is a little bit less than what you said, but for most communities who are doing the studies, it's quite a bit less than that. Still, it's a significant portion of their budget, and it's a significant investment. Often, these are the numbers that motivate the community to act. I think one of the most common examples is that communities find out, we didn't actually know that we had any Jews who live in that part of the geography. We thought all the Jews lived here where all the Jews live, but in fact, they're all spread out. And maybe we should be thinking about providing some services out there, wherever that may be. Now, you might say, you already kind of knew that there were a lot of Jews out there, which is why you did the study. But it's not enough to kind of push them over the edge. So I think that is the value of giving them information and often opening people's eyes to some of the issues that maybe went under the table. A lot of people who are involved in these studies, by their nature, they're very involved in Jewish life. They're working for Federation, or they're on the board, or they're working for Jewish organizations. And as much as they understand that there are a lot of Jews in the community who don't think and act like they do, in fact, they don't really get it. And these studies help to understand, I'm the outlier. Only 20% of the Jewish community is like me, and the vast majority are some different way. So that's the value helps to direct resources, helps people understand where are the priorities. That's really the purpose of the study. That's how communities use them. But I will say it's hard. It's hard to look at the numbers and translate them into action. But I want to get to your other point. So now we've done at the Cohen Center at Brandeis, we have done about 25 of these studies. Looking at them together, there is a gold mine of data. And it's a project that we're hoping to work on to pull all of it together and think about projects that cross communities or, we have such a range of communities, large, small, East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, South, so we really have a variety of Jewish experiences. And so not only can we look at national trends in a way that Pew couldn't, because this is much more data and we have many more questions. But what we could also do is look at some groups, smaller groups, let's say Jews of color, where in any single community, we don't have a lot of Jews of color in the survey, so we can't say that much. But if we put them together across all the surveys, we can tell a lot. So that's a really focus of our work going forward. But just as people have to fund individual studies, they also have to fund that work. So just because we're in academia doesn't mean that our work doesn't need funding. It's the challenge to find someone who will prioritize this kind of work.
I want to think about what local means. I generally want to think about what that means in our shifting society because, selfishly, I work for a digital Jewish organization, and we in certain ways could be understood as a kind of local. It's a different kind of local because we're transgeographic, where we have people spread out all over the country and the world who listen to us. But I want to drop some numbers for a second, not because I want to brag, but because I just want to think about LA through this prism. I just looked at our back end and we actually have data on where our listeners are. In the last 5 years, Judaism Unbound has reached 25,866 unique people in Los Angeles alone, somewhere in the Los Angeles area. And they've played Judaism Unbound collectively 113,000 total times. This is just LA that I'm talking about, not everywhere. So sometimes I think about if I were to hide for a second that we're a digital project and I were to say to somebody in Los Angeles, there's a new organization, it's about 5 years old, and in that time, it's engaged 25,866 unique people, Jewish and not, in Los Angeles. I think people would say, oh, wow, we want to know about that project. We should probably support that in our Jewish community. And they'd think about that project as a Los Angeles Jewish project. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is I could give similar data for all sorts of other cities. And so no one city in the country thinks of Judaism Unbound as a local organization. But I give presentations all the time where I start by asking people, how many Jewish organizations are there in your city? And they usually say, and it depends on the city, but if they're in a small town, maybe they say 5. If they're in a mid-sized city, maybe they say 20. Really big city, maybe they say a couple hundred. The real answer is thousands, because there's all these digital projects. And so I'm curious to hear your vantage point as somebody who, you've devoted your life's work in many ways to studying local Jewish communities in the traditional sense. They share a longitude and a latitude. We're not that. But how might this start to shift how we think about Jewish life, how we think about these studies? Because more and more, I actually think that the locations where Jews are not just Los Angeles, Bay Area, rural Arkansas, Israel. They're .com, .org. There are various places like that.
Right. So we ask in our studies, how attached do you feel to the worldwide Jewish community, any local community where you live, the city where you live? And since COVID, we've added an online Jewish community. Now, the highest is for the worldwide Jewish community. The middle is for the local Jewish community. And then the lowest is for the online Jewish community. This is one of the fallacies, I think, of looking at the numbers, because then people might say, oh, let's dismiss the online Jewish community because it's the lowest. But the fact is, there are an awful lot of people who are saying, I am strongly connected to an online Jewish community. So we have that. And it doesn't matter that that's lower than the local Jewish community because it still represents an awful lot of people. So that's one way that we're trying to capture that information. And this has become an increasingly important question during COVID. The notion of a virtual community is, it existed before, but that's when people really got interested in it. The notion that geography doesn't mean that much when you could attend services at your synagogue or some synagogue in New York or Israel or wherever you want because they're streaming the services. It's really changing the barriers about what does it mean to participate in Jewish life. One thing I will say, this was from our studies during COVID, is that there was really a hope that the online would attract all sorts of new participants, new listeners, that maybe it was too expensive, it was inaccessible, the time wasn't right, and now it would just sort of open up the world. What we found, I don't know if this is still true, but what we found is that basically it was attracting the same people, but instead of doing their local synagogue, they tried a distance one. Maybe instead of, going to a lecture, they started listening to podcasts more. So it might have expanded the pool a little bit. It didn't totally expand the pool, but it really expanded the options for people who are already interested.
I'm really grateful for the depth you've gone into all these questions with us. I'm going to really shout out to listeners to go to our show notes on the website where we have a link to the study itself and to this really lovely website that has, different PDFs for all sorts of different ways you can engage with the study. I think for all our episodes, I hope you look at the show notes, but for this one in particular, seeing the way that this was structured will help give some color to the kinds of conversations we've been having in this episode. But I do want to close just by returning to one piece that we didn't go into in too much depth, which we talked about, the class analysis. We talked about the 5 groups you made in that respect, but we didn't talk so much about what you did that I think is really beautiful with different immigrant subcommunities. So you don't just look at the Los Angeles Jewish population and then give, here's the number that are in our 5 groupings. You actually go and say, there's a really strong Persian Jewish community here. Let's figure out ways in which they are deeply, interestingly Jewish that are not the same as the Russian-speaking Jewish community, which you also look at deeply, and the Latinx Jewish community, and also LGBTQ Jewish community. That's not an immigrant community, but that's also in the same PDF. I apologize if I'm missing any, but it's this really wonderful, once again, snapshot that helps us remind ourselves just how different Jews are from one another. So often, and this is kind of why I want to close with this question, so often we have this image in our head of what the desired Jew is, the kinds of projects they'd be a member of, the kinds of things they donate to, the kinds of opinions they'd have about the world or about Israel, I really think we have to get away from that. And it feels to me like a prerequisite for getting away from that good Jew, bad Jew idea is by just thoroughly complicating the picture and throwing out all these different visual manifestations of Jewishness, Jewish identity, Jewish practice, Judaism that differ from one another. And that's what this PDF is with these different immigrant subcommunities and LGBTQ Jews. So I'd love to hear, just as a closing note, a little bit about what you saw there.
Okay, so first I want to just add one thing, which also should have said earlier, is that the way we presented the results of the study in Los Angeles, that is different than any other community. If you look, for example, in Chicago, which just did last year, that is about a 200-page report full of numbers, which is what works for them. They are really data-driven. Los Angeles was really looking more at how do we tell the story for the general community and the whole website. And it's forced us to really think harder about what are the stories behind the data. What, in some ways, it's sort of easier to say, here's everything we found. You, reader, you pick through and find what's interesting. It's very challenging to go through and say, okay, what do we really want people to know? So creating that report of we called it the diversity report, because that was one of the central questions that drove this study, and the decision to look at those specific groups, and adding to the list that you said are Israelis, Jews of color, and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. So I think that those are the additional groups. One of the challenges, so we tried to create a kind of overview of each of those groups to sort of give the size and some of the key distinguishing features. But even in this, with that report, what we tried to be really sensitive to is we don't want to make comparisons between the groups. But as soon as you put down the number that says X percent of this group does this and X percent of another group does this, you sort of run into the problem. Are we making some kind of judgment? And we try really hard not to. We try to provide this information, but once it's there, it's easy to jump to that. And as we finish the study, we're writing the rest of the reports. We're being really sensitive to this question throughout, that we are trying to describe, not to judge, not to evaluate. And honestly, personally, that's how I truly think. And I hope that it comes through in the report. I really embrace this I have, maybe I wasn't always in this position, but I have truly learned to embrace and value this diversity. And I think it brings richness to Jewish life, but it makes it a little harder when we talk about what does it mean to build a Jewish community and all the things that we were talking about before. How much you develop targeted programs that say, like, for this group needs this and this group needs that. And sometimes you have to do that, but then that just exacerbates this feeling of we are this fragmented community. So I think that's the challenge. And whether we're talking about age groups, ethnic groups, or anything else, I think that's the fundamental challenge that I think the Jewish community is facing.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
I've really enjoyed it. I love having the opportunity to talk about this with you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to start this outro, this closing part, by saying, really, go to studyofjewishla.org. You can find all the PDFs that we just talked about, the diversity report, the key findings of the study. If you're really nerdy like me, you can go into the few hundred-page technical appendix that tells you exactly how different formulas and stuff were set up for the study. Really cool stuff. Studyofjewishla.org. There's also a link to the study in our show notes on the JudaismUnbound.com website for this episode. We want to close out this conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of our handles are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, to learn more about us. And you can always email us, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com, if you have particular questions about this episode, or just ideas you have for the Jewish future, or rants you have about something we said that you don't like. All of that is really encouraged. Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com are the email addresses to send any of that to. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 50